All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode. Hey everyone, before we get into it today, just want to give a quick shout out to this season's sponsor, Rook. Close to $1 billion worth of MEV has been taken out of users' pockets, and that's just on Ethereum, and that number is only getting larger, unfortunately. Rook thinks that it's time for a change, and they've built a solution which is going to automatically redirect that MEV back to where it belongs, into the user's pocket. So you're going to be hearing all about them later in the show. I'm a huge fan of this team and what they're building, so stay tuned to find out more.
All right. This is going to be a great episode, Hasu. Welcome back, by the way, from your well-deserved break. Looking a little tan there, looking nice. We've got, today we're going to be joined by Quintus Kilbourn and Barnabé Monnot. Hope I got that pronunciation.
Got it right.
Yeah, nailed it. It's the last time I ever attempted a French accent. Could you give listeners a little bit of a taste of what they can expect on this episode?
Oh yeah. So first of all, thanks. It's good to be back. Been 3 weeks in Italy. It's been great. Feeling much more relaxed than before. So I'm very much looking forward to this episode, which will be the final one of the season, except for our kind of own recap episode that we will provide at the end. And today we have two amazing guests. We have Barnabé, who was working at RIC. So RIC is the Robust Incentives Group at the Ethereum Foundation. And you can think of that as kind of the very kind of hands-on research arm that's focused on economic problems and economic developments. So they are thinking a lot about PBS. They are thinking about kind of the effect of roll-ups, MEV supply chain in general, in the future also order flow auctions. So you can think of them almost as they are looking at all of the things that are happening and how they affect Ethereum, the economics of Ethereum, and how, if at all, Ethereum should react to these things. And so we are working a lot with Barnabé as part of Flashboards and the rest of the RIC team. And so I know for a fact he knows like a ton about this and has very strong opinions, backed by facts. So the other person is Quintus Kilbourn. So Quintus is one of our senior researchers at Flashboards. And so he's someone who's like one of the leading experts on OFAs. He wrote very similar pieces on OFAs, on exclusive order flow, on information sharing and the role of privacy. And he's someone who I learn a lot from personally. Just so when I have a question, I go to Quintus and just ask him to explain something to me. And so I also know these two get along great. And so I think it's going to be very cool to have them here in the same episode. And I think we will talk about kind of how the MEV supply chain is going to evolve. So this will be a much more Ethereum focused episode. So coming out of the cosmos, going back into the ether, and we already touched on so many themes, right? In this season, we touched on OFAs, we touched on privacy, division of labor, we touched on proposal bidder separation with Matt Cutler, and we touched on SWAF with Robert and John. And this would be the episode where we put it all back together. So we have the floor in front of us, and we take out the whole MEV engine of Ethereum. We put it on the floor. We dissect every piece individually, and then we talk with these two, how they relate to each other. The interfaces between users and searchers and builders and validators, and then ultimately we hope we're going to put it back together and put it back where it belongs.
That's all the intro we need. Let's dive right in. All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Today, Haas and I are joined by Barnabé Monnot and Quintus Kilbourn. Guys, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Mike.
This is going to be a really fun one because this is going to basically touch on a whole bunch of stuff that we have discussed so far this season, and sort of the North Star for this episode is going to be the changing of the MEV supply chain. But each of you guys are focused on very cool components of that. And maybe, Quintus, we can start with you. I'd love to talk a little bit in depth about something that we've touched on this season, which is order flow auctions. And I know you are super, super steeped in that. And we haven't really we've sort of touched on order flow auctions, this thing that's happening at the beginning of the MEV supply chain, but we haven't gone in depth at all. So maybe if we could just start from a level, could you just give an overview of what these order flow auctions are and how they're kind of acting as this new center of gravity on that MEV supply chain?
So I guess when people hear auctions and MEV, they sometimes think of the bundle auction where, we have searchers or like traders that get submitting bids to effectively to the validator via block builders to have their, trades included, their arbitrages included or whatever, higher up in the block when it's in some preferential ordering. When people do what order flow auctions, it's a very different kind of auction. And really the sort of like what defines an order flow auction is that usually it's a user trying to either get better execution or to get some sort of rebate for doing some transaction. And the way they get this is through leveraging competition. So a very basic example is someone's doing a trade and the trade on Uniswap or something, it leaves an arbitrage on the table. Or maybe they're trying to find a counterparty for the trade, take the other side. And through some mechanism or other, you use competition, and usually it's like, trading firms or searchers bidding, and then depending on how the auction's set up, the best bid, quote unquote, ends up being the one that executes the order. And I describe it kind of vaguely because there's many different ways of doing this, but that's a general idea.
Great. And so what problem would you say these OFAs are trying to solve in general?
A couple of ways of explaining it, but in general, I think blockchain and finance in general, in traditional finance as well, is very complicated, and it's more complicated than the average user can deal with. In part, this is because you have all of these DEXs, all of these sources of liquidity. Some of these sources of liquidity you don't even know about because they're active, right? It's someone with like tokens in a wallet, maybe. But there's also just some sort of like very like low latency information or very like, technical information that just isn't going to be accessible to like 99.9% of people, like the state of the net, or the like price on Binance a couple of milliseconds ago, and these kinds of things. And so most users blockchains aren't really in a position to make the most effective trade or do the smartest thing on the blockchain. But sometimes it's also the case that thinking very abstractly about what people do on blockchains, it might be the case that someone is just they're doing something that happens to be valuable to someone else. It's an Oracle update, and it's changing the state of the blockchain, and that represents value to some liquidator or something like that. And so the problem with solving, I think, is like it's in part making these trades more efficient, capturing the money left on the table if you made a bad trade, but maybe also capturing the surplus you create as the person doing the Oracle update. It doesn't need to be an Oracle update. You can think of it more broadly.
Right. So if we imagine some like a user trading on Uniswap V2, then there's obviously things that searchers can do in order to make that execution more competitive. For example, by competing on adding a background to that transaction. But do you think that there will also be kind of other approaches that we can go about this, where the user maybe doesn't specify as much how their transaction should be executed? Like, how do you think that's going to evolve?
Yeah, and that exists, right? So, if a user is trading against Uniswap V2, they've sort of specified the full computational path. They said, okay, listen, this is my transaction. I want to trade against these pools in this way, and there's like some variance in the outcome based on slippage, but there's nothing, there's not much like freedom of movement there. But we can have users sign in like 4337 kind of intents, or like CalSwap's another example of this, and then the auction kind of finds them the best source of liquidity, whatever that may be. In the CalSwap example, users are being sort of matched against each other, and then whatever other source of liquidity the solvers in the auction find. But you could also just have like an RFQ system, like 0x or 1inch, in which case the user says, hey, like I want to do this kind of trade, and then a bunch of different routes are offered to the user, different quotes, and this will be like like searchers or trading firms or whatever, finding good routes against passive liquidity. So it doesn't have to be like a background kind of thing, but it's different auctions have different trade-offs.
So talking about different auctions with different trade-offs. So what design families for OFAs exist in your mind, and how do they trade off against each other?
I've been asked to like give a families of OFAs before, and I find it very hard to do because I think very small differences make important have important consequences. But like very generally, I think you can. One of the interesting ways of segmenting things is saying, okay, well, you have these kinds of auctions that allocate execution to sort of like an exclusive party. So, for example, like I think the sponsor of this podcast, Rook, is like how it works is I'm probably oversimplifying, but you have one order, and you have many orders, but then you have some server or whoever is holds onto the order. At least that's how it's worked up until recently. Maybe they've changed it, but you hold on to one order, and for some time period you accept bids, and then the highest bidder is allocated the exclusive right to execute this order, and that's like one way of doing things. And what this requires is whoever's bidding at the time of the auction to like be able to value the execution of this order relatively well, because sometimes there's a delay between when they're bidding and when they're executing, and this might mean the price moves or that like the cost of executing the block changes, and that might that introduces some risk for the bidder who's bidding in this auction. Then you have this other like family that's exists right now on the two sort of canonical, or the two examples I know of, are like MEV share, flashbots, and MEV blocker, and they do this they work with block builders, and they go through this process where they connect user transactions with backgrounds. They say, listen, like this user transaction's opening up surplus somehow. Usually it's because they're leaving some arbitrage on the table. Say, okay, we'll just connect a bunch of backgrounds, and then when the block is being built, we'll agree with the block builder and we say, hey, if you're going to include this a bundle from this user, in some sense you have to be including the bundle that pays the user the most. And the benefit of this is that you are able to incorporate more information at block building time, but it is also like a different kind of auction. In the Rook case, it's easier to match against like active liquidity, whereas in the MEV block and MEV share case, you're like already have like fully specified computational path, like I was explaining with the V2 example. And there's like many other things you can do as well, but I think that's like one interesting division that's come along recently.
So to summarize, you're saying that basically the kind of the biggest differentiator between the auctions is whether you have a format where there's two auctions happening sequentially, or one auction, right? And in the two auction case, first the auction of the right to execute the transaction to a single searcher or trading firm or whatever, but then they still have to see that the transaction is actually getting included in a block, and they have to go through the block builder auction and so on. And in the second case, you have one block builder doing, like the actual block builder doing the entire auction, and kind of the OFA is folded into the block building process, right?
It's not exactly like that clear cut. There's definitely things in the middle. Like what if you have a block builder, the bidding in the sort of the two auctions case versus like a searcher. But yes, that's roughly that's a way I would describe separate them for sure.
Interesting. Yeah. So you mentioned an interesting concept, the concept of block building time. And I think we want to kind of put a pin in that, and we get to that a bit later when we talk about some of the other concepts in the MEV supply chain. So thanks for that overview. Do you think that there are any things beyond trading that kind of you could apply in OFA to, any types of transactions that you could send to an OFA that would also benefit from it, that kind of go beyond what people classically associate with OFAs, which is kind of just like Uniswap trades?
Yeah, of course, everything kind of looks like a trade at some point. Like everything's an all. That's the meme, right? But yeah, like a very basic example is like an Oracle update, right? Or sometimes there'll be like this is a bit of a strange example, but I think it's still useful. Like, so do an NFT listing, right? And sometimes you get the price wrong. And if you did happen to submit via an OFA, you'd be able to sort of capture some of the value of your accidental bad listing. I don't think that's hopefully it's not the primary use case. I think we can maybe figure out the bad listings some other how, but some other way. But yeah, I think there's anything that represents value to someone else, right? And your blockchains, like Turing complete, or at least Ethereum and like smart contract chains, or effectively for Turing complete. And so there's a whole lot of different things that can happen. Maybe right now, like DEX trades is the most popular thing, but who knows when this goes going forward. But yeah, I guess everything looks like a trade if it represents like value to someone else.
I have a question just about, maybe Barnabé, this is where I'm calling you a little bit here as well. I know you've talked, about kind of determining where the line for the Ethereum protocol sort of exists. And one question that I have, maybe connecting a couple of different interviews from this season, especially the last interview that we did with Cosmos, is the Cosmos approach to MEV is very much, we have an application here, maybe it's a decentralized exchange like Penumbra. There's MEV that's being generated, and that's sort of baked into the design of that DEX. So I would love, when you're sort of hearing this, MEV is kind of simultaneously a problem and an opportunity. A problem in the sense that there can be negative outcomes for users, but an opportunity in that there is economic surplus that's often created. I would love to get your perspective on who do you think the sort of problem and the economic value should accrue to, kind of the app layer or Ethereum layer. And, kind of speaking from, I guess, your perspective, but you do work at the Ethereum Foundation, like how does Ethereum kind of think about getting involved here?
Yeah, so as always, it's very difficult to make blanket statements for how Ethereum considers something. It's the idea of the bazaar versus the cathedral, but I can talk about what my thoughts are on the topic. And I did listen to the episode with Henry about Cosmos, who was saying that the transaction supply chain, that's the whole of Ethereum. Like, Ethereum doesn't stop at the protocol side. And what you're seeing with Cosmos, for instance, is you have much more activist protocols like that are adding this layer of programmability of decision making with respect to how the MEV is managed and how it's kind of captured and then redistributed. I would say in Ethereum the trade-offs are maybe a little different, or at least the constraints are a little different. First, you don't necessarily have all trusted proposals, so you always want to create designs that are credible even in the presence of untrusted proposals, and that adds a lot more constraint to what you can do with the protocol. And then because you are not in this let's say app chain perspective, you also need to consider second order effects on what can happen when you build in something that's maybe more favorable to one category of applications, and then might have ripple effects on other applications that could suffer from it. So I would say the perspective has been to be a bit more conservative in terms of the update and maybe a bit less opinionated about the way that the MEV is managed at protocol level. But that doesn't mean that choices aren't being made, because when you look at PBS, for instance, there is an opinionated choice that is made when we're talking about enshrined PBS, for instance.
So staying with this notion of kind of application layer versus protocol layer, I'd have a question kind of to both of you. I know, Quintus, you've thought about this a lot more, but Barnabé, you have like a very keen understanding of economics and markets. So I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts as well. So Theo Leibowitz from Uniswap's former head of strategy, he went on a podcast recently and he said he thinks that generalized OFAs will not take off in the marketplace because all the applications will kind of develop their own individual order flow options or their own individual ways of dealing with MEV, and they are not, so for one, they can kind of specialize more, but also they're not interested in sharing any of the economics with an outside protocol. So how do you think about this trade-off? What will happen, basically? Will applications all succeed in developing their own MEV solutions, or will we see kind of a generalized OFA layer maybe on Ethereum take off, and kind of what are like the arguments for and against these things?
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot to say. I think it because it kind of depends what you mean by application as well. Like, is Uniswap the application or trading the application? Right? So the first thing to think about here is that if it is the case that we separate things and you have like a very specific auction for every specific use case, you do miss the like capturing sort of the complementarity between different opportunities, liquidations and ARBs and these kinds of things, right? Now liquidations and like trading ARBs, with backwards liquidations. You get what I mean? I think also you have to think about this from like a centralization, decentralization perspective. Like, I think it seems kind of undesirable to have like the only effective way of using Uniswap being like going through some centralized server, and that also like kind of defeats the point. And I don't know if that's what he was suggesting. So it might be the case that like multiple auctions that work for a specific application. My like general preference, and I mean many people with Flashbots have spoken about this, and it's a very interesting idea, I think, is to have some sort of like general layer that acts as like a sort of like a programmable auction, and that can facilitate many different kinds of auctions for different kinds of applications. And the benefit of this is that you're not stuck with the one auction that's like one front end is offering you, and that's the only way of accessing Uniswap or whatever, because you're trusting some server they set up, but rather have a world where we have many different auctions and they're running in some way that you trust, or that it is in some sense decentralized, but also that allows people to pitch different kind of auction formats. If this one auction format isn't working, someone can always experiment. The problem with running trusted auctions is that it's very hard for someone else to launch other auctions. Right now, the biggest auctions have spent like a lot of time garnering trust for people, trying to get order flow adoption. Flashbots is a well-known name. The people involved with MedBlocker, well-known. CalSwap spent many years, and it comes out of Gnosis. So there's a lot of reputation that goes into this, and so it becomes very hard for someone else to go like, "Hey, I actually have a great auction idea. Let me set up an auction," because it takes them like a lot of time to gain trust from people, and it might not even be possible. So if you can provide this with like a more general auction layer that can be programmed to be, facilitate more specific kinds of auctions, then I think you end up doing quite well, in that you allow people to compete and propose different kinds of mechanisms and have these work quite well, but still capture the sort of like specificity of different kinds of auction needs. Because yes, it is true that, maybe the kind of auction which is best for DEX trades looks a bit different from the auction that works well for NFTs or something like that.
Adding to that, I would say there are fairly strict results on even the computational complexity of running auctions. And so if you're trying to do like this generalized matching engine, for sure that this is going to be basically impossible to solve. So the question, can you put that at protocol? Like, can you make the Ethereum protocol basically organize this auction? Seems to me like it's a tall order that's going to be running against some fairly essential or fundamental limits. So then the question is, if you don't do that, what do you do? And I think that was kind of a gist of Hasu's question, which is that will we see piecewise auctions of just like separate flows for the user transaction to go through application per application? I think at the beginning we'll see that, because it's just easier to do when applications have kind of a finger on the bottleneck for the user transaction flow. But as Quintus mentioned, there are complementarities between these applications, and if there are complementarities, there is value. And if there is value, there are people who are going to innovate on formats and figure out how to capture that value. But then I don't think we'll ever get to a point where this converges to a generalized auction that solves everything and matches everyone at the same time. And so should the protocol then be involved, my perspective is that when it does, we are kind of locking in a certain type of allocation mechanism, and perhaps we don't want to do that. Perhaps we want to preserve the optionality of innovation in terms of the auctions, or even the market structures might change over time. So we want to give ourselves as much room to be agile and to let the market kind of figure out the best mechanisms for that.
I would say that everything is already one auction in some sense, right? There's already, everything needs to go into the same block. And so it's all economically interrelated already. And the question really is like, how many, different, is there like, a different route that everyone takes, that everyone goes through some like specific auction first and then it all aggregates together later? Or like, I guess one sort of like more dystopia, utopia perspective on this is like, yes, you do have this potential world where you have many different auctions. You have one where like there's like 3 or 4 or I don't know, some small number of like servers running in like US East 1 AWS, executing everyone's trades, and then you have a different world with different kinds of auction outcomes, and so it's very up in the air, and it's very much I think there should be like a call for like decentralization and pushing forward there. So that's also I think the more like important point to make. It's that very unclear and they're like worse and better outcomes from here.
Fascinating, guys. I want to kind of close the chapter on OFAs for now and move to the next one. So one thing that we always discuss, and I think one of the original reasons why we're here is kind of the problem of vertical integration. Originally, I think the fear was that mining pools would integrate with searchers, and then there would be one dominant mining pool that kind of can crowd out all of the other ones that would lead to centralization, right? And this has been many years ago, and now, of course, the MEV supply chain is much more complex than just mining pools and searchers. But the problem of vertical integration remains, and arguably it's bigger and kind of more elusive than ever before, right? So we are seeing vertical integration between wallets and searchers, between searchers and block builders, between block builders and relays, and who knows what else is there that we're kind of not aware of, because these things are very hard to prove. So could you maybe reiterate why vertical integration is such a big problem for the MEV supply chain, and how we can address this problem at a high level, or kind of how you personally think about addressing this problem at a high level?
Sure. So the first question is, why is vertical integration such a problem? And I think it really comes to why we are building the systems that we are building, which is that we want systems that are efficient, but we don't want systems where the efficiency can be, or the extra surplus that the system creates can be extracted by a single party. And so when you have vertical integration, you basically take 2 entities that would be in a relation of checks and balances, or maybe in tension with one another, and now you're kind of merging them together. And so you might be expanding the action space for that bundled entity to extract more value through whatever is going through its pipeline. So why we care about vertical integration is really because we care about having systems that are loosely coupled, and each part of the system or each component is unable to extract any kind of rent on what's going through its pipe. And if you have vertical integration, you also prevent to some extent competitivity, because now if you have one searcher on one side and many builders on the other side, there's at least a bit of competition between the builders to offer something to the searcher. But if the searcher and builder are the same, now they can do strategies that are different, and they don't need to be quite as competitive. And so building systems that prevent any kind of rent to be extracted at any point, I think is what we're here for. And so vertical integration is a threat to that.
I have a follow-up question for you there, Barnabé. I would love to understand how you think about builders, and specifically builders getting larger and more sophisticated. I think, one of the parts of the sort of like a design principle that's been extremely successful, at least in Ethereum so far, is kind of this idea of basically leveling the playing field for proposers and making sure that they're adequately compensated for securing the Ethereum network. I think one of the trade-offs there, and I'm sure we'll get more into the weeds on proposer-builder separation, is that you have kind of these larger and more sophisticated builders. And without going too far into this, we had a whole episode on the modular MEV in the modular world, but it seems like that's only going to be kind of exacerbated as we move up the stack to roll-ups. So I would love to get your thoughts on, is builder centralization something that you spend a lot of time worrying about, or what's your sort of thoughts there?
Yeah, we do worry about builder centralization insofar as we care about the signal that PBS is giving us, and the signal should be equally the same for all proposers. And so if you now have builders that are more powerful and that capture like private order flow, in a sense that can add some noise to that signal or destroy some of the value that would be going forward. So if you don't have the same competitivity on the builder side, you don't let the value propagate towards the validators and eventually towards the protocol who's behind the validators. And so builder centralization is a bit worrying in the sense that now again you have this one actor in the supply chain that's able to extract undue rent, and which maybe is not compatible with this idealized version of a builder, which is more of a simple pass-through that forwards the value towards the proposers and the protocol eventually.
Quick break from the show here. I want you to imagine something for me. Imagine swapping two stablecoins on chain, paying $0 in gas, and instead getting a rebate of $2,000. This is something that's actually happened on chain. To understand how, I want to introduce and thank this season's sponsor, Rook. Zooming out for a second, the current state of affairs at MEV is billions of dollars so far have been extracted from users' pockets using MEV. Rook is coming in and saying enough is enough. Blockchain should drive value to their users and the applications they use. It is time to leave the hobbyist era behind us if we want to move forward and we want to get this right. That's why Rook has built a custom blockchain settlement network, and it's one that gives you full control over the entire transaction lifecycle. Today, you can connect to an open source Rook node. The Rook protocol will automatically match, bundle, and auction your orders and transactions in seconds with zero gas overhead. Also, any MEV that's discoverable along the way will be returned to you, the user. Created as a collaboration between the industry's top mechanism designers and MEV engineers, Rook was built from the ground up to be scalable, safe, and programmable. You can get your own mempool, choose searchers and builders, and link your mempool with others to discover even more MEV. You can define how the MEV is shared and delivered as well. And Rook can basically process anything from transactions to meta transactions and more. This is the way that blockchains basically should have been from day one. So, if you're a user listening to this, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to your wallets, go to your favorite app, your node provider, and say, hey, I want you to be working with these guys, Rook. I want the MEV that I create to be redistributed back to me. If you're a developer and you want to stay ahead of the game, the best way to do that is to follow them on Twitter. They are at Rook. Or even better yet, slide into their DMs. They are lightning responsive. They'll get you set up today. And if you do slide into those DMs, as always, please tell them that I sent you.
Quintus, I'd love to get your tag you in here and get your thoughts on just vertical integration in general. And then, any thoughts that you might have about builders getting larger and more sophisticated.
Yeah, I think Barnabé sort of caught the crux of it. I think vertical integration is in the, sometimes it makes sense. Like it's just like, the consensus layer and execution layer, like vertically integrated in some sense, but makes sense. Two things are brought together in a client. But in the searcher builder case, maybe it's less desirable. Like the searcher validator case is less desirable because then you have centralization vectors. And I think one of the interesting things I can say about vertical integration about in block building and searching today is that I think part of where it comes from is that there's all of these different searches and they aren't able to collaborate well in the sense that we might be both doing some strategy that touches the same, like MEV 3 pool or something, changing that price, but because we don't trust each other, there's no real mechanism for us to do it. I can't collaborate with some other searcher and say let me know what state you're going to leave the pools in, so I can like better calculate my strategy for that, or things along these lines. And so what builders do is they play this role in the network where they say, okay, we have to aggregate all this information. Well, all of these people didn't know how to like form a block together, and I'll be in this like special position where I have all of the information. I'll put it all together, and the way things are set up at the moment, that's necessary. But what that also means is that these builders have like a lot of additional information, which is like super useful in searching, HFT, and traditional finance as well. And that's why you see a lot of vertical integrations, because they have this sort of informational edge, and really makes sense for them to take advantage. Well, it doesn't make sense, but I mean, there's a lot of economic incentive for them to take advantage of it. Background bundles, and so their own trades, given all this kind of information. I think if you can sort of see which thing you can address to help alleviate that.
Yeah, so you said searchers can't collaborate well on the one hand. And you also said builders have all of this extra information. And so these might be the same thing, right? But extra information and kind of also like a latency advantage, so they can act later in the game. In finance terms, they have what we would call the last look, right? They can kind of react closer to the actual event that matters. How should we think about like dealing with this in general? Like how searchers and builders, they arguably have started to become kind of the same party, because there is a big economic benefit for a searcher to be a block builder, or for a block builder to start searching, although arguably kind of all of the skill is in the searching and not in the block building. And so it's kind of, we're seeing kind of the integration that way, that all of those parties who were originally big searchers, they have now become big block builders. We haven't really seen it the other way around, that there's someone who's like uniquely good at block building and they then branched out into searching. So we're not really seeing that. I think that's a nice indication of where the actual power resides in the supply chain. But how should we think about kind of breaking these two roles apart?
Yeah, I think you can think of it sort of like thinking of the fundamental requirement of like, okay, all of these different strategies after like all these different transactions or whatever have to end up in the final block. And then there's tension, which you find in these like highly sensitive environments where your information is super valuable. And so if someone else knows when I'm bidding for an opportunity or what arbitrage I'm doing or whatever it is, that means that they can act on that. And it might not even be that they're on like, explicitly, copy trading me. There's like a much more subtle things they can do, just like sort of maybe derive what kind of prices I predict in the future based on my trades, or maybe just bid a little bit higher when they like share bundles with other people or something like that. But the point is that if I'm a searcher and I'm sharing my information with other entities, I'm making myself vulnerable. And at the same time, we need to share information to some degree, because somewhere this block needs to be created somehow. And of course, we could do like this completely private building thing, but then we lose. Everyone just sends some encrypted blob of transactions, and then we all randomly order them. Maybe we spam to get better ordering. I don't know. And then whatever that random ordering is, or like not random, but like informationless ordering is, we go with that. And that's, I think, arguably also undesirable, because you lose a lot of economic efficiency. And so now the question is, how can we, how does one facilitate collaboration between all the users, right, and the people, like entities acting on behalf of the users, and people who just want direct access to block space, like searchers or whatever, who are just like sophisticated users? How do you facilitate this kind of collaboration? And it, sort of in my mind, that's, and I think heard Flashwell's people speak about this before, is this like notion of programmable privacy, in the sense that you allow users to walk this line between sharing information that helps them, achieve better ordering in the block, better outcomes, whatever, collaborate with other searchers, and at the same time preserve their privacy. Even from a user's perspective, right? If a user submitting to some car swap trader, or I don't know, I'm submitting to MEV share, I'm currently trusting Flashbots is sort of doing the right thing with my information. and only, acting in a certain way. And the idea of programmable privacy is to say, listen, I'll only expose the information necessary to Flashbots to be able to facilitate this kind of auction.
Barnabé, do you see any parallels between programmable privacy and kind of the protocols that you have been working on? Is there anything that kind of comes to mind that connects?
Not immediately comes to mind, but I would say it's definitely part of the stack. But because again, if you want the builder to reveal a good signal of what the value of their block contains, you essentially want the builder to be a bundle merger. So you want, by the time that the information leaves the searcher and gets to the builder, that this information is not really actionable anymore, apart from just putting it in order in the blocks. And so you really need that programmable privacy part here to first ensure that the builder makes a commitment that they can't touch whatever has been given to them, and before that the users have not been harmed during the process of extracting in the bundle. Did you have something in mind when you were asking that question?
Well, maybe just the idea of kind of credible commitments and how they can facilitate collaboration, which I found to be kind of a connecting theme in a lot of your work.
Yes. Yeah. So this is something that I've been thinking a bit more, also in collaboration with Shin, who's at Flashbots. First, the idea of commitment, which is, who's making commitments and who's kind of recording them. So I've been writing a bit about this. The protocol making commitments is kind of the most powerful commitment that you can get around if you believe in the accountability of the validator set. So that's a strong commitment you can make. But you might also want to be able to have commitments at lower levels of the stack. And so you want builders to commit to not front running you, or to commit to just doing honest bundle merging. You want order flow auctions to commit to rebating you some of that value. So this commitment part is useful beyond the protocol, and it doesn't necessarily always have the same internal mechanics of how these commitments are recorded. And that's where I would say the credible part kind of comes in. So I've discussed a bit in a recent post how I think about credibility, and in particular the credibility of the Ethereum protocol at making these commitments and at enforcing the mechanisms that are enshrined in the protocol. And the protocol makes it credible because essentially we have the weight of the whole community, which is delegating the duty of enforcing these commitments or enforcing these mechanisms to a protocol that is executed by a set of validators that are bonded and that are staked and that have a lot of money on the line to kind of enforce these commitments. So that's one aspect of credibility. And then lower down the chain, you still have commitments, but the credibility here is a little different. So you might have commitments that are written on rollups, for instance. In that case, there's a trust model which maybe is a little different. You have commitments from the builder side, which Suave is trying to make. So there's many. I think what this work has kind of taught me is that I don't necessarily think of mechanism design or credibility as like 0 to 1 thing. Like either the mechanism is there or it's not there. To me it's more complicated than that, and it's more multidimensional. And credibility is a big part of why this is the case.
By the way, maybe this is a good time to transition into talking about PBS. And you've done a lot of thinking about this, I'm sure privately, but also publicly as well. So I would love to kind of get your thoughts on the current state of PBS, which is sort of facilitated by the off-chain MEV boost solution. And then I would love to kind of get your thoughts on, what, and if you could even just like sort of explain for listeners, like what was the decision? Why was this decision decided to be enshrined in Ethereum, and what does the roadmap look like towards that?
So what's the latest on PBS is, so PBS has essentially been live in its current form since the merge, and the form I'm talking about is you have validators that are sourcing whole blocks from a network of builders. I think that's been fairly interesting for us as protocol designers, because now you kind of see the shape of the market, like how the market has developed. So you have, I don't know, it's been interesting, for instance, to observe that there's been more diversity in the relays now than there was at the beginning, more diversity in the builders, though it seems that there are also pressures towards more centralization still. So seeing that live, kind of out of protocol, gave us a lot of, I would say, useful data to think about the problem. On my side, I've done a bit more work to think about it theoretically. So the question of enshrining PBS is essentially the question of enshrining an auction in protocol. And so when you enshrine the auction, there's a lot of parameters that you kind of need to decide. One of them is, do you auction off the right to make the whole block, or do you auction off the right to make a partial block, or even partial blocks, plural? How do you think about the enforcement of the bids? How do you think about the credibility of the auction? Once the value is kind of elicited by the auction, how do you manage it? Like, what do you do with it? Do you give it back to the proposer? Do you give it back to the protocol? So there's a lot of questions that are interesting. And before thinking about these questions, I had thought quite a bit about EIP 1559. There are very interesting parallels between the two mechanisms in terms of, in both cases, you're trying to elicit from the perspective of a protocol a signal of value that is credible and that actors, essentially validators, can't bias. And so, yeah, these questions have been, to me, quite fertile. So I've been thinking about them quite a bit since the last year, and I feel, yeah, we've reached a much better understanding of what the auction could look like. We understand a bit more some of its trade-offs, and so what it looks like in terms of getting it to Ethereum, I think is, yeah, there's some really nice work, for instance, by Mike Noether and Justin Drake on the optimistic relay, and that includes an actual roadmap of making the optimistic relay as close as possible to what would enshrine PBS look like. So yeah, I think this is probably how that will go. I had some doubts with respect to enshrining the auction, because again, there are trade-offs that you need to make, and so you're always wondering, are these the right trade-offs? And once it's in protocol, you're kind of, yeah, you might be stuck with it. But I feel a bit more confident now that we've seen more data, now that we have a real upgrade path to putting it there. So yeah, that's kind of how I see the state of things.
What do you think are the current problems with MEV Boost?
Well, there's one problem that has been revealed pretty dramatically by the attacks that happened at the beginning of April, which is that MEV Boost didn't deal very well with equivocating proposers. And so even though the system is designed with the idea that untrusted proposers can access this market, and there's this fair exchange that happens between the builder and the proposer, in this specific case, it failed. And it failed for a reason that I think was just not imagined back when the system was designed. And so, yeah, that's obviously it's a bad thing that it happened, but it also gave some useful data in terms of hardening both MEV Boost. So there's a proposal by Mike and Francesco called Headlock, and in fact that proposal carries over to how we think about enshrined PBS, so PBS in protocol. So yeah, that's, I would say, one problem. The other problem for me has always been the whole block auction, selling away the entire right to make the block. I think there are some examples that show you that this might be suboptimal in terms of the value capture. It might be more centralizing. In fact, Quintus was one of the first, I think, to discuss this in a MEV Boost issue, and showing that if you have a centralized builder, they could do better, even if a decentralized builder is able to, in theory, aggregate more value. In that case, the centralized builder would still win. So yeah, I still see some unknowns on that question, but again, with the perspective of putting it in protocol and giving ourselves a path to experimenting a bit more with it before it reaches there, and maybe even after it reaches the protocol, I think this is these are the two main problems I see.
I've got a question for you, Barnabé. This harkens back to a debate that we had earlier this season between Hasu and Matt Cutler. and it was very centered around relays specifically, but maybe we could broaden it a little bit to just talk about off-chain infrastructure in general. So something like relays, that the plan to enshrine PBS is eventually we're not going to need relays, right? And they're kind of this centralization vector. But on the other hand, if Ethereum is going to be very careful about the line for what the protocol does, probably it's pretty reasonable to assume into the future we're going to continue to rely on off-chain infrastructure for relatively key functions of Ethereum. So I would love to sort of get your thoughts, and maybe we can start with relays, but kind of broaden it out a little bit to infrastructure that we might not even know we need. Do you think how do you kind of weigh the costs and the kind of risks and benefits of, hey, we don't want to rely too much on something like a relay, so it shouldn't necessarily be too profitable, versus, hey, there are off-chain actors that are providing critical infrastructure to Ethereum, and if we want that to function smoothly, we want them to be economically incentivized to keep providing that infrastructure. So I'd love to get your sort of thoughts on that cost benefit there.
First, it's clear from even Vitalik's endgame post that we're planning to rely on off-chain agents to perform what you could call core or critical functions of a protocol. And this is really coming from the asymmetry between the cost of constructing the block, so finding, for instance, a validity proof if we were to enshrine a ZK VM at protocol level, finding the most optimal blocks, which is what PBS does, optimal in terms of the value that they return. So yeah, definitely for sure there is kind of this emphasis on off-chain infrastructure to perform these things. But then I would say, as you mentioned, there is a difference between relays and builders, which is that relays are kind of a crutch that we have at the moment because we need MEV boost to function, and if we don't have a protocol to enforce the auction or to be the credible auctioneer, then we need someone else in the middle to basically broker the agreement between the builder and the proposer, and that person is the relay, but they perform, I would say, an off-chain role that is temporary in the perspective that enshrined PBS will happen, and so they don't, I would say, for us, have the same dynamics or the same economics as other entities that are there to stay in the long run, like builders, for instance. And so yeah, builders have kind of been this go-to black box. So whenever there's something that requires a bit more computational power than we're willing to assume of the proposers, we say, builder can do it. And so we have proposals now for statelessness, where you have to provide some kind of state to the block to execute it. And if the proposers are stateless, then the builders are going to be the ones who need to make that provision. As I said before, you might have validity proofs in the future. And so it does seem like we're relying more and more on these off-chain actors. And again, there are opportunities to this because, yeah, we do, it's almost like adding extra computational power to the network as a whole, even though that computational power is bounded in time. So we want to think carefully about how do we enforce and create the relationships between this off-chain infrastructure and the protocol itself. Yeah, that's my long-winded answer, but I can be more precise if you like.
Barnabé, are you worried? Like, is the Ethereum Foundation worried about creating too much pressure on builders and to do additional tasks that could ultimately raise the barriers to entry?
I think it's a worry if the control and competitivity of builders, or rather the control over builders and the competitivity of builders, doesn't scale as fast as the number of tasks that we give them. So if we find that there's a good enough market of builders doing the blocks, that might put us at ease to add more things to the builders. So when I said earlier the sensor, I said there's like all these roles that the builders will have to do. But obviously the pace of upgrades is not super fast. So we will see over time, I would say the cracks in the builder market as they appear, and we might take that into account when we start thinking of builders should do like a million different things, etc. And again, we speak of builders as like this abstraction, which is more like you have this nebulous entity that is performing things on your behalf, but it's very clear that builders will not be a central server that is just outputting everything that you need them, and that builders themselves will decentralize. Builders themselves will figure out that there are economics that work better in their favor when they are more decentralized. So yeah, I think we can also lean on that when we think about the role of builders.
PBS is basically like one component of it is validators making commitments to block builders to include a particular block, and that allows kind of this new layer of commerce to happen between builders and validators. You already now, some time ago, you made a proposal that seeks to generalize this idea of validators making commitments to parties in the supply chain. It's called Pepsi.
Proposer commitments. Yes.
Could you briefly go over like what's the kind of line of thinking behind this proposal, and also what kind of new use cases would it enable in the MEV supply chain?
Yeah, so this proposal came at a time where, again, I was feeling a little concerned about enshrining something too specific in the protocol, and that might not give us good optionality if the market structure changes, or if we figure out that that specific auction format is not actually suited for what we're trying to do. At the same time, I was quite interested in Eigenlayer and this idea that you can have proposers basically signing up for making commitments and making these commitments credible by putting their stake that they currently have in the Ethereum protocol at stake for other duties that they are then signing up to perform. So I was excited by this because it gave me a sense that, there's like this other layer of innovation you can do that is still close enough to the protocol, but not the protocol itself. So yeah, it gives you the flexibility without giving you the committing to like this specific mechanism. But at the same time, I was seeing some risk with Eigenlayer. So the first risk I was seeing is that the protocol might not know that the validators are committed to Eigenlayer. And if they do bad things on Eigenlayer and the Eigenlayer kind of writes down that a bad thing happened, the protocol might not know. And so what's at stake for the validator with respect to the Ethereum protocol might not actually be the real stake because they got slashed off then by Eigenlayer. And so I was proposing first, okay, we need to at least ensure that this principal agent problem between the protocol and the validators is resolved by aligning everyone's view on what is happening and what proposers are doing outside of the purview of the protocol. So that's the first step. And then the second step to Pepsi is saying, well, what if instead of them signing up to these additional slashing conditions with Eigenlayer, we allowed them to programmatically create essentially validity conditions for their blocks. And so saying, instead of waiting to see the validator did something and then they get slashed, which I called optimistic validity, we make them write down what their validity conditions are, and we evaluate the block validity based on whether these conditions are satisfied or not. And this is, let's say, a pessimistic view of block validity. And that it's still a theoretical proposal, but it's something that we've been spending a bit more cycles thinking through and trying to do a proof of concept of this system. But essentially what it does is it decouples PBS between two things. One, which is the market structure, which is that there's a legal system that ties proposers to off-chain entities, and the legal system requires that the exchange be made fairly between the two. And the second part is the allocation mechanism. So what is the shape of a contract between the proposer and the builder? So when you do PBS the way it's discussed today, you do both at the same time. You both enforce the market structure and you enforce a specific allocation mechanism, which is the whole block auction. And so Pepsi was the idea of, what if we could only enforce the market structure, but validators were completely free to enter into any commitment that they want to enter into? And there might be plenty of reasons why that's a bad idea, because there are maybe commitments that we don't prefer validators to enter into, such as censorship or reorging on demand. But there are maybe ways that this gives us a bit more freedom to explore what proposers can do.
Amazing. Okay, that wraps up our segment on PBS, and I think we're entering kind of the last concluding mini chapter here. So, because I do want to talk about putting it all back together now that we laid out this entire MEV supply chain in front of us. We deconstructed it. We talked about the interface between users and searchers and block builders with OFAs. We talked about vertical integration between searchers and builders and why it happens, and that we need division of labor and so on. But then we also talked about kind of the interface between block builders and validators. So Quintus, kind of in your words, like if you zoom out 5 years, how do you think the MEV supply chain is going to look? And also maybe as a side note, where do you think kind of Swarf will fit into that?
Yeah, I feel like it's a meme by now to say that Swarf just solves it all. Yeah, I think if you want to be really realistic about it, there are a couple of ways that things could go from here. There's maybe like some worst case route where things centralize, but just enough so that like there's no like real reaction from the community, and so you still have like a high degree of centralization, but it's like minimally acceptable, and that's like how we roll with things. And maybe that's like a couple of centralized OFAs and a couple of like centralized builders. And that's that, and that's really the world we're trying to avoid. And so maybe to like zoom out to a world that Swarf's trying to create, and that I believe will be the world that exists in 5 years' time, is this world where you still have an interface between the protocol and this market, and maybe like to Barnaby's point, maybe it makes sense for it to look a bit more expressive than it does right now. It's not just a full block auction; it's something more complicated the proposer commits to, or who knows. But something like PBS, in the sense that there's a market for producing the next block, and then sort of where Swarf fits in is really everything before that. And I said that we want to facilitate collaboration between the different users who need to end up in a block, and part of that is users who want to participate in an OFA, trying to with the auction, trying to capture get better execution, these kind of things. So you want to provide them the tools to share their trades, share their information without being front run or screwed over, but also give them the power to like really express, hey, like give me the best possible trade at this point of the block, or whatever. And at the same time for searchers to Swarf ideally provides them with the ways to protect the information, but also to give them enough information at like block building times or as the blocks being constructed, so that their like strategies are sufficiently valuable. And maybe Swarf provides other kinds of information at block building time, so that high frequency or low latency kind of races aren't important, because there's a Binance price oracle at block production time, and so people aren't racing to get the most most up-to-date like Binance prices in their bundles. And there's all like a bunch of details, but zooming out, what does that like ideally look like? It looks like this sort of like set of primitives, or the sort of like middle layer that exists between all of the users of the protocol, be they like sophisticated searchers or just being new, through this layer we've allowed collaboration and hopefully production of the most valuable block possible, from like a welfare perspective, not just from the validator's perspective, but still valuable enough to compete with centralized venues, and through this like PBS like auction with the validator setting produced blocks of Ethereum. That's like a very, very high level view with a couple of specific details.
Yeah, Barnabé, I wonder if you have anything to add to that.
I don't have too much to add to the view that Quintus kind of presented. I think that's also, as I hope, the most decentralized possible transaction supply chain. But maybe I can add a bit more color on what my thoughts have been, which is I've been interested lately about the path dependency of how things sort of happen, and in particular how protocol development is somewhat oriented by what's happening in its environment. And if I was to try and draw a very rough distinction between Bitcoin and Ethereum, is that I see Bitcoin, people thinking about Bitcoin as like this. You're discovering the protocol, like you're discovering it as a platonic shape, the way you discover like a new physical law or kind of mathematics. And I would say Ethereum is somewhat still has this pretension of finding natural laws of its protocol, like where the MEV should go, how to do things, but it's still much more responsive to what's happening on its layers. And so if, for instance, there was too much centralization or too much censorship to our taste, I think we would put more accent on things like inclusion list to defeat censorship, or pre-mempool consensus to ensure that transactions have to be seen by a large set of actors before they are included, and not necessarily transaction in the clear, but you could see commitment to transaction and then ensure that blocks have to be made with transaction that everybody has seen. So there are ways to kind of step in and maybe backstop some excesses of the market, but these ways they're not like platonic shapes of protocol. They're more like a real politic of maybe actually we see the market like heading off to the wrong direction, and or the market is not maturing fast enough to defeat the censorship or centralization pressures, and then you kind of have to maybe do something about it. And so I'm very torn on what's the right approach to that, but it's something that I've been thinking about a bit more, and I think it's relevant here.
Fantastic. Thank you guys so much for coming on the show today. I think you both provided really great perspectives and gave our viewers a great overview over how the MEV supply chain, like what are the individual components to look at and how those are going to evolve in the future, hopefully. But if not, also what can be done to save the day. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure.
All right. What a great final interview for the season. That was a ton of fun. And both Quintus and Barnabé, just such deep thinkers. I'd be curious, what kind of takeaways did you have from the episode?
Oh, well, first of all, I agree. I think it was a fantastic episode. I love hanging out with Quintus and Barnabé, both of them. I think they're both they have such a, calming attitude, and they are so good at explaining things, right? They always can take a step back and, put things exactly where they belong in context and find the right words, which I find really impressive. So very often when I have a question, I actually reach out to one of them. And so it was great to have them on together. And talk about the MEV supply chain. So I thought that we covered pretty much everything that I wanted to cover. So I was very satisfied.
Yeah, me as well. I wanted to get a little bit deeper in the weeds with you on auctions because I thought that was a super interesting part of the conversation, but I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on that a little bit more and go in depth a little bit. And I know you mentioned to me early in the season, I think in our episode with Tarun, that you are a little bit of a nerd about auction theory and kind of like going down that specific rabbit hole. So I'd love you to kind of unpack. You kind of listed your own sort of segmentation about different types of auctions that exist. Can you sort of just rehash that and then talk a little bit more about how you think about the different, maybe just expand or clarify or just go a little bit deeper on the different design families that Quintus spoke a little bit about at the top of the episode?
Right. Yeah. So between the three of us, I think I'm like, of the two guests and myself, I'm probably the least of an expert about auctions. And Quintus, I think, this was one of the things that he studied. And so, I think he's really smart about that. And most of what I know, I only know from talking to people like Shin and Quintus in Flashbots. So, well, it's a good question. So I think Quintus, he gave a good overview when he said that there are kind of a few ways to slice the pie when it comes to different order flow auctions. And what he drew out in particular was whether there's kind of one auction, whether it all happens kind of inside the block builder and you rely on kind of the computational power of the block builder, but also on what he called kind of block building time, right? Because the block builder builds the block at the last possible moment, and they have all of the information about all of the other bits, and so they can really optimize for kind of the most optimal block, right? And I think that's one of the main ideas behind MEV Share, the OFA that we built, but also behind MEV Blocker. So that's kind of another OFA that's out there right now, and that's in contrast to some other OFAs that for example are RFQ based, right? Or the one that Quintus mentioned, which is Rook, the current sponsor of the show, which kind of have this two-step process. First, they auction off the right to fill a particular transaction, and then that transaction still has to enter the builder auction in order to get it included in a block. So I think that was very illuminating. And on the other hand, I think one big trade-off is going to be so specialized versus generalized. I think we touched on that briefly when I kind of cited Theo Leibovitz. So that's going to be a big question, like how specialized are the different order flow options going to be? So you can have an order flow option that's very kind of specialized, for example, on trading or on backgrounding Oracle updates or any number of things. But then Quintus was hinting at something which is kind of the complementing kind of complementing use cases that you can unlock from having kind of one generalized order flow option, right? So there might be different submissions to different types of order flow options that don't really seem related, that from happening inside the same auction unlock some kind of combinatorial benefits, whether it's batching or whether it's kind of matching things against each other in the sense of like cows or coincidence of ones, right?
Right.
So one example actually, so I used to be kind of very engaged in the Maker community. And so Maker's liquidations, so when Maker was liquidating a CDP, that trade was actually routed to 1inch and could then be matched with people trading in the other direction, right? And so that's a kind of a small detail that even something it seems kind of obscure, like it's like there's a CDP getting liquidated, but as Quintus was saying, everything is a trade at the end of the day, right? And for every trade, you can have a counterparty. Kind of the more information you aggregate in one auction, the higher the welfare that you can generate from the auction. And so that's really important. And then the third thing that I'd kind of would draw out is that of kind of the auction credibility.
Yeah.
So we already had Tarun on, so I think he's kind of the foremost expert in crypto on kind of credible auctions. He had this really, I think he has already had 2 really great papers on this topic. And so the idea of auction credibility means basically, is the auctioneer going to be honest? Are they going to stick exactly to kind of the rules of the auction that are laid out? Both in terms of, are they respecting kind of the privacy of bids? Are they inserting any of their own bids? Are they censoring any bids from any bidders? Are they leaking any information maybe outside the system? And so really there are all kinds of things that auctioneers can do that kind of undermine the integrity of the auction. We had already discussed one example with kind of Google inserting bids into their own ad auctions to drive up the price, and now they kind of are facing a big antitrust lawsuit, well deserved for that. But all of this stuff happens on a much smaller scale, right? So, for example, in the block building market, there's complaints from searchers that particular block builders are censoring their bundles, or that they are looking at their bids and kind of just like one-upping them, or that they are stealing the MEV, right? So this is all kind of things that can happen, and a lack of trust in the MEV supply chain really leads to more vertical integration because it makes collaboration between different actors harder, right? Because if I don't trust you, then I'm less likely to send you my order flow, for example. I'm less likely to send you my trade. And so what this means in particular for OFAs is, I think that kind of you can gain some more like efficiency in some ways by running more centralized infrastructure, but you can get more social scalability and more credible neutrality by making a more credible auction, one that kind of has its rules enshrined on chain and that doesn't really have any trust assumptions in the auction here itself. And I think these are kind of the three criterias, how you can kind of slice the OFA pie, and then you can fit almost any kind of order flow auction, any kind of trading scheme into that.
Yeah. There's so much to unpack there. And one of the things that I'm sort of kicking myself from the notes for the pre-call that we didn't get to was this idea of exactly what you were describing on the credibility of the auctioneer, which was, I think it was Quintus that called it auction extractable value. So sort of a fun play on an MEV, but just obviously there's an enormous benefit if you're the auctioneer, right? In the case of Google inserting your own bids, because you're incentivized for, a more, you want to make the ad market more, right? Exactly. But I would love to get your thoughts. Could you give your own thoughts on Teo's argument for kind of where the app versus the protocol ends up sort of succeeding? Because I thought it was a really interesting observation from Quintus that there sort of already is one auction at the end of the day, right? It's one block, right? So everything already is economically tied. And even if you look at sort of the role of, I think it's an executor on CowSwap, but basically it's, these executors kind of have carte blanche to kind of go off and find, go off through the land of Ethereum and find the best execution and deliver a surplus to traders on CowSwap in general. So I would love you to kind of tease apart like how you see the different incentives playing out, because obviously these exchanges want to internalize some of the economics that they're creating, but then I also see the benefit to being a completely credible sort of auction system. Yeah. So I would love to just get your thoughts on how you see that ultimately playing out.
Yeah. So first of all, I think the concept of auctioneer extractable value is super interesting. And like once you start to look, really, it's everywhere, right? So look at the kind of CFTC lawsuit against Binance. There's at least 5 examples where kind of Binance was also like extracting auctioneer extractable value on behalf of its users, whether it's from like selling preferential access kind of to like to their servers, or whether it's kind of trading on their own exchange and so on. Right? It's like this stuff exists actually everywhere, and I think that's one of the major bull cases for why more and more economic activity is actually going to happen on top of public blockchains, because they are simply more trustworthy. You can design more credible mechanisms on top of them, and so at least kind of that's for us, like internally, one of our North Stars is like that all auctions should eventually run on Ethereum, that all auctions should eventually run on Swav. And so we're really kind of focused on providing kind of a very credible auction that can compete with kind of these more centralized, these less credible systems. So to your question about specialized versus generalized auctions, I think this is going to be a very interesting thing to observe. Obviously, kind of we're betting that there is at least a strong need for a generalized auction to exist. That doesn't mean that there will not also be specialized auctions. I think so. Because the user and kind of the application come before the block builder and so on in the MEV supply chain, they have, of course, the monopoly over their own transactions, and they can send their order flow wherever they want. And I think we'll see at least a lot of experimentation. And just economically speaking, it's hard to deny that there is some benefit to specialization. But as Quintus was alluding to, so you do have kind of a lot of benefit also from having complementing transactions inside the same auction. And I think there are more transactions than people would generally believe that are in some way complementary, especially when we stop kind of hard coding the execution paths of transactions. So once we move to kind of a more intent-based transaction format, all of a sudden, kind of the space of possible coincidences of ones starts to go up by like 2, 3, 4 like orders of magnitude, in my opinion. Just because like when you just have intents, they're so much easier to match than if you have kind of hard-coded execution paths. But I thought that his other argument was even more important, which is if you have one auction and ultimately it's all about kind of allocating like this kind of preferential block space, then you can just create ultimately like a more valuable block, and you can make you can kind of fill users' preferences in a better way, right? And so I think any system, any auction system that doesn't happen at the block building, like at what Quintus was calling block building time, I think it will have a very natural disadvantage over a system that does. And so I think those are some of the main reasons why we are betting on kind of an auction that happens at block building time, and that really like is an argument in favor of having one generalized auction. So having all of the information in one place, and then kind of auctioning it off or merging it into a block all at once. So I think that's for us one of the ideas behind also like the like unifying auction, right? Which is Suave. And so so I think that's kind of how we think about that. Credibility also, of course, would be very important. So I think it's much easier for someone to build like a new blockchain that kind of only serves the purpose of like running an order flow auction for another system, for like another chain, and make that decentralized than it is kind of for every exchange to develop their own order flow auctions. I think the latter is much harder to decentralize, and I think we'll see that in some of the designs that are coming out in kind of the next couple of months.
By the way, I realize we haven't really defined a coincidence of wants, but that's sort of like a classic example of this in the FX world is sort of like a ring trade, where there are maybe, sort of, you can imagine 3 different participants with different currencies that are, maybe it's like, the yen, the renminbi, and the dollar, and they're all equal kind of once you adjust for conversion rates, like the same amount that you're trying to change. So you can imagine just like a circular sort of trade, right? So that's just the definition there. And I do think we talked about this a little bit with Penumbra, but the batch auction, this is super interesting. Maybe we didn't get into it, so maybe it's not worth it to delve in here, but I think that's a super interesting new format as well to explore.
Talking about, CowSwap is doing like a bunch of these things as well, right? So they have the batch auctions, but they also, they kind of optimize for these coincidence of wants, in the sense that they only, so in Uniswap, the difference is like every auction trades against the market maker, even if there's bits coming in the same block that actually trade in opposite directions. Someone wanting to buy ETH and someone wanting to sell ETH against USDC, right? So in theory, they could be matched against each other. It would be strictly better for the users, but that's not possible in Uniswap. They all trade against the same liquidity pool. Whereas CowSwap is this layer on top where the 2 parties are matched against each other, and only kind of whatever can be filled through these coincidences of wants is then routed to an exchange like Uniswap, right? And so I think batch auctions are very interesting because they eliminate some, not all, but like most forms of front running, and also kind of there's this very interesting paper. I think we already shouted it out like once or twice from Eric Budish. His argument is that batched auctions actually kind of reduce MEV that's lost to latency raises between trading firms, and so that would be another argument. Like, of course, kind of in this like exchange between users and market makers, the less MEV is leaked kind of to third parties, the better. And so any protocol that we think is kind of advantageous here, of course, deserves a very good look.
I wanted to transition a little bit and just sort of, if users or if listeners are sort of sick of me hearing me say this, then I apologize. But it's just been super fascinating, I think, to do this more sort of Ethereum perspective season right after Cosmos, because they're just such different perspectives. Where when you listen to Barnabé, and obviously Barnabé doesn't speak for all of Ethereum, but I think he's relatively representative of the philosophical bent of the platform, which is very much focused on credible neutrality and preserving optionality and not wanting to enshrine a decision. Whereas in Cosmos, maybe the reason they have a little bit less, there's a little less value to secure. So they kind of have this nice is this trade-off where they can actually be much more opinionated about the design of MEV and user experience. It's super fascinating to kind of stack those two different perspectives, one against the other. But it has just been a very cool instance to see where these two sort of design spaces and opinions are converging. Like that exact phrase that you just said, Hasu, about not wanting to hard code users' intents. You can go to this episode. Obviously, we talked to Barry. Unfortunately, you weren't able to be there, but I talked to Barry this season. But there's a great episode on I Pledge Allegiance, which is a great podcast between him and Dave Oha, which is one of the founders of Osmosis, where he talks about exactly that idea, where you should be a little bit less prescriptive about hard coding intents in. And I would be curious just to get like your particular, I think you've probably spent between Maker and Lido and Flashbots a little bit more time on the Ethereum side of things, but I would love to kind of get your perspective on sort of that philosophical division between Cosmos and Ethereum.
Yeah, I'm really bummed that I had to miss the Cosmos episode, because you're totally right. I definitely have a bend towards Ethereum, but I'm very interested in what they're doing in Cosmos, because they can move much faster and they can try stuff that we frankly cannot try in Ethereum, and but they can nonetheless like yield very interesting results and very interesting data points that we can ingest, right? And the reason that they can move so much faster, of course, on the one hand is that they secure kind of much less money, but their chains are also kind of much more like specific towards individual applications. So in Ethereum, everything that we change about the protocol layer affects millions of different users, right? Many of which have kind of opposing interests. And the goal, like the very kind of specific goal for Ethereum, is to be this credibly neutral base layer on top of which like many different things can be built, and they can all coexist. And if you deploy something, then you have a very strong guarantee that your application is not going to be broken by the next update. And the Ethereum Foundation is trying really hard to honor that promise, right? And kind of to enshrine that idea of credible neutrality. And Cosmos doesn't have that problem, right? Like in Cosmos, they are like, so looking at Osmosis, for example, so full disclosure, I'm an investor at Osmosis, but so they have like permission smart contracts, for example, right? So if you want to deploy a smart contract on Osmosis, like you have to get it permissioned by governance, for example, right? If they have a rule that validators in Osmosis are not allowed to sandwich like a user, for example, right? Even though they totally could, right? It's just like this understanding that, so if a validator does that, then it's going to be a governance vote, and then we get socially slashed. And like all of this stuff would be completely impossible to enforce in Ethereum, right? There's no governance layer, first of all, in Ethereum, where people can vote with their coins that a particular validator should be slashed. So even the idea in Ethereum is like so outlandish that it's like not even possible to entertain. And so because you're so much smaller and so much more nimble, and you can do all of these things that are completely impossible in Ethereum and vice versa. And so Ethereum just has to take a very different approach. It has to be much more slow moving, and a lot more stuff has to be built in ways that do not break the existing guarantees of the system, and that do not require any kind of rapid or breaking changes to the protocol. And I think this is the main reason why in Cosmos they can just move so much quicker, and they can change the protocol in ways that in Ethereum we can't, and why we have to look more into building stuff that's compatible with the status quo and kind of layer stuff on top of it.
Something that I hear out of the Osmosis community, and I do think it would have been great to get, especially Dave is very outspoken about his views on MEV, and it's been sort of antithetical to a lot of stuff that we've talked about this season, but it's kind of this idea of what can your validators do for you, as opposed to, it's like the opposite design principle in Ethereum, and the, having the explicit aim to commoditize validators, I think, is part of what makes Ethereum's block space so valuable. But it is kind of an interesting thought experiment that's playing out in Cosmos about, like, if you have more sophisticated validators that understand the application code as well as the consensus layer, it's just pretty interesting overall. And maybe maybe like the segue that we can sort of close on here is privacy. Because I know you've done you've spoken to Henry, even though you weren't on the episode, and sort of looked into Penumbra a little bit, and it's fascinating what they're doing. It's just interesting to hear his story, not starting in MEV at all, right? He was starting from the perspective of privacy and protocol design, and then he sort of wound his way up at Penumbra. And I would love to just we didn't get to talk as much about privacy in this episode as I would have liked, but I know it's been a big focus for you. So I would love to get your sort of closing thoughts on kind of privacy. And we didn't talk really much that much about like threshold encryption or anything like that. But yeah, I would love to maybe close with your overarching thoughts on privacy here.
I also thought when he said that on the interview, so I was listening back to it the other day, I thought it was really interesting that he said that they hadn't actually started with any kind of application in mind, that just been working on privacy. And I think this is a very common experience for a lot of people in crypto, actually. So if you look at Monero, if you look at Zcash, like these original kind of these privacy OGs, the argument for privacy was always more like ideological, right? It was like, oh yeah, people deserve privacy. Monero maybe a bit less so. I think there was like always more, well, we need privacy in order to kind of transact on darknet markets and so on, right? Monero was always built like slightly more maybe with kind of a bit of like the government as like an adversarial actor in mind, whereas Zcash was kind of built more with the idea that it's private, but you can comply if you want to. We make that like really easy for you. And I think what we're seeing now that we have DeFi and that we have much more kind of merging between like TradFi and DeFi every year that goes on, and kind of more and more experts from mechanism design and so on coming into crypto. I think we now all of a sudden see like another branch of people who say, well, we need privacy, but not for like any ideological kind of reasons. We need it because without privacy, you cannot build like efficient markets. Like we actually need privacy for efficient markets. Like the internet didn't take off before there was like encryption. There was like no, like you don't have like online communication without encryption. You don't have like people paying online with their credit cards, but you also can't have like efficient auctions, efficient marketplaces. Like if someone could see that I want to buy like a particular item on eBay or on Amazon, they can front run me, like none of this stuff will work, right? So now I think we have this much more real, like tangible need for privacy that we didn't have in the past, when kind of the lack of privacy was not exploited in the same way, and also there wasn't as much economic activity. And so I find that super interesting, this whole like stream of thought. And I think we will see, I mean, just like privacy for me is going to be the big topic in the MEV supply chain for the next couple of years. Just because we need privacy in order to kind of break this current trend of vertical integration. You need privacy to enable division of labor between different parties, and you need it to build more efficient markets. And so I think kind of the next 10x, maybe 100x improvement that we will see in Ethereum will come from encrypting the MEV supply chain, kind of from the moment that a user like sends their intent to the time when it's being confirmed on chain. I think when we can build that, I think just Ethereum as a base layer would just be like so much more useful as a platform kind of to deploy your mechanisms to build new markets on top of, but also to use any of the systems that already exist. And so I would say, yes, I'm super bullish on the concept of privacy, not for the ideological reasons, but just for kind of the very tangible reasons that I laid out.
So I would also put myself in the camp of I would love ideologically to see more privacy in general. I will say privacy seems to be one of the rare sort of bipartisan issues in Washington, at least. Like people don't seem to really value their privacy that much. And I do, talking to some people in crypto who've like worked on privacy solutions, I wonder if that's kind of this thing where we might need to wait for an Overton window for people to care about it. But I would just sort of put myself in the camp of hoping from an ideological perspective that privacy becomes something that we build into our systems and people start to value a little bit more. But I totally hear you on the more pragmatic aspect of, for auctions to work, there needs to be some measure of privacy.
It was this way with, I forgot what it's called, like main encryption protocol online. So I read about that like some time ago, but there was a big debate about whether encryption should be allowed online, right? And I think it was like not any of the philosophers or anyone making kind of these ideological arguments that ultimately swayed kind of the United States government on that being okay. It was just like the very pragmatic kind of industry coming together and saying like, it's not gonna work. We need encryption to do commerce online. And so I think there will have to be a similar push eventually in crypto. Like it needs to be okay for things to be encrypted. Otherwise, like commerce on the blockchain is not gonna work. And so if I had to guess, I think that time will come. When, I'm not sure. But in the meantime, we just keep bidding.
Any sort of closing thoughts, Hasu? I mean, I know we've got our sort of individual wrap up, just the two of us, but like, I don't know, anything you want to bookend or leave listeners with or anything like that?
I thought that the one thing that we didn't touch on here now in this like post discussion, I thought it was very interesting. Just the position that Barnabé takes as part of the Ethereum Foundation and like the kind of how he shows like us how they think internally, which is that they are kind of very focused on like not letting things get too far out of hand. Right, so they look into different things. They look into like PBS and builder centralization. They're also going to start looking at OFA, and then they basically think about things that could be deployed, but not with the intention of deploying it, more so as a kind of nuclear option, right? Kind of as a way of like kind of disciplining the market, right? And I think you see a lot of parallels here with just like regulators in other markets, right? And so far, I think they've taken like a very light touch approach, which I think is exactly the right way of thinking about like a system like Ethereum. And so, yeah, I think that's really interesting, this kind of these parallels between like the Ethereum Foundation and like a regulator.
I think it's, you know, in this season, I think we've wanted to stay relatively in the weeds and a little bit technical, but it's also been, yeah, I've found myself sort of wondering what's the right mental model or framework to assess protocol design. And I think it's much less looks like a business and much more looks like a government and regulators. I think there's a great talk John Adler gave, I think, at one of the DevCons where he explicitly sort of went into more detail about the analogy of regulation on Ethereum. So, all right. Great episode, Hasu. I think we can leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mike.